This resource video will provide you with an overview of the Title I Part A Schoolwide Program Campus Comprehensive Needs Assessment requirement being monitored as part of the random validation process being conducted by the Federal Program Compliance Division. Each LEA selected to participate in the random validation process for the Title I Part A program was provided the name of one school-wide program campus. The LEA will be responsible for submitting the documentation requested for only that one school-wide program campus. Keep in mind that documenting overall compliance for a program requirement may require several forms of documentation to be maintained locally and available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. To ensure overall compliance with program requirements, LEAs should refer to the Title I Part A program guide and/or other program-related resources that reference the multiple forms of documentation required to be maintained locally. The documentation requested for this submission during the random validation process may not include all forms of documentation that are required to be maintained locally. The documentation required for Item 1.1 is a description of the campus's comprehensive needs assessment process. The LEA will need to submit the relevant page or pages of the comprehensive needs assessment or campus improvement plan that includes the description of the current school year's campus's comprehensive needs assessment process. The following items should be included in the Comprehensive Needs Assessment description: CNA dates, stakeholders, areas examined, and data sources analyzed. Let's now take a look at the specific information for each of these items. CNA dates refers to the dates that the CNA was developed if a new campus, or the dates that the CNA was reviewed and revised for the 2021-2022 school year. Stakeholders refers to a list of stakeholders involved that includes the individuals by name and their roles. Please note that parents may not be LEA employees in order to fill the parent roles on the committee. Areas examined refers to a list of areas examined in the CNA process. For example, curriculum instruction, demographics, technology, parent, family, and community engagement, school culture, etc. Data sources analyzed refers to a list of the multiple data sources that were analyzed as part of the CNA process. For example, academic achievement, prior year program evaluations, student attendance, student discipline, college and career readiness, etc. In summary, the description that is to be submitted to satisfy item number 1.1 of the CNA process program requirement should include the CNA dates, stakeholders that participated in the process, the areas that were examined, and the multiple data sources analyzed. For CNA item 1.1, there are several issues that may result in the LEA receiving an improvement needed status. The LEA should be aware of these potential issues as they prepare their documentation for submission. Potential issues include that the auditable documentation requested was not submitted. Another potential issue is that the CNA summary submitted did not have all the required components. And finally, another issue is that the prior year documentation was submitted instead of current year documentation. The documentation required for item 1.2 includes meeting agendas, meeting notes or minutes, and participant rosters documenting the campus's CNA process. There are several documentation requirements that the LEA should be aware of. It is highly unlikely that a CNA process would take place in one meeting, considering that the process should be comprehensive in nature. Therefore, an LEA should share documentation from multiple meetings to establish compliance, which we would define as at least 2. The documentation submitted should provide evidence that the CNA process described in the CNA description referenced in item 1.1 was followed. The standard meeting documentation that an LEA should maintain locally includes meeting agendas, meeting notes or minutes, and sign-in sheets. Please note that documentation for virtual meetings is an acceptable form of documentation. Given the increased use of virtual meeting environments, participant rosters that include the meeting title, meeting date, and stakeholder names and roles would be acceptable substitutes for the more traditional sign-in sheets. This eliminates the need of a participant signature. Please refer to the table referenced on this slide to determine what is required on meeting documentation and what is considered best practice. Meeting agendas should include the meeting title, campus name, date, and time. It is a best practice to include the location of the meeting. Meeting notes or minutes should include the meeting title, campus name, date, and time. It is best practice to include the location of the meeting, stakeholder names of those involved in the process, and stakeholder roles. The participant roster should include the meeting title, campus name, date, time, stakeholder names of those in attendance, and stakeholder roles. It is best practice to include the location of the meeting. Please note that parents may not be LEA employees in order to fill the parent roles on the committee. We will now look at requirements associated with program requirement number 2. For CNA documentation for item 1.2, there are several issues that may result in the LEA receiving an improvement needed status. The LEA should be aware of these potential issues as they prepare their documentation for submission. Potential issues include the auditable documentation requested was not submitted. Another potential issue is that the documentation submitted does not reference the CNA process. An LEA should make every effort to ensure that their documentation submitted, such as the meeting agendas and meeting minutes and/or notes, make reference to the CNA process. Another potential issue is that the documentation submitted for 1.2 does not align with the CNA description that was submitted to meet the CNA item 1.1 documentation requirement. For CNA item 1.2, we will be verifying that the evidence of implementation submitted aligns with the CNA description submitted. And finally, another issue is that the prior year documentation was submitted instead of current year documentation. Please note that it is customary for an LEA to have begun and completed their CNA process in the months preceding the 2021-22 school year. Documentation dated in the months preceding the 2021-2022 school year is acceptable as long as the documentation shows evidence that the LEA was engaging in the CNA process for the current school year, which in this case is the 2021-2022 school year. This concludes the presentation of information for this program requirement. If you have any questions, please contact us via telephone at 512-463-9310 or via email at essasupport@tea.texas.gov.